Jeff Rath, thank you so much for joining me today. This is a special treat. I'm going to try to keep up with you because it's always a challenge. You're a big guy, a lot bigger than I am, but you just seem to move. You seem to move, and you've been on the move lately. Holy cow, full stride. Alberta Prosperity Project. Tell me about it.
Well, APP was an organization that I was involved in founding about 4 years ago. I was concerned in Alberta, with sort of the tone and tenor of a lot of the Alberta independence groups, and they weren't groups that I was comfortable necessarily associating myself with for a lot of reasons, including, and it's become quite topical, including, issues in and around Indigenous rights. I mean, I think, as you know, I've spent my entire career fighting on behalf of the rights of Indigenous people in Canada. So I was concerned that there wasn't an independence organization in Alberta that understood or respected the rights of Indigenous people in Alberta in the context of independence. So I just thought, it was easier to start from scratch by forming an organization that was geared towards teaching Albertans about the benefits of independence, both to the citizenry at large and the First Nations of Alberta, which are a couple of the goals of APP. So, that's kind of how it all got started and how I got involved. And of course, it's grown into something of a bit of a monster of late, where we now have, well over 100,000 committed members and volunteers. Since Carney was elected, incidentally, we picked up 15,000 new volunteers. These are people going, hey, how can I help? Not just like, here's my name and address and, my pledge for a signature on a referendum ballot, which we'll come to in a second, but how can I help? We want to get involved. We want to, we want to be involved in what you're doing. Put us to work. We want to help. So if you think about it, 15,000 hardcore volunteers in the last 5 days in APP. I mean, we have more volunteers now than there is infantry in the Canadian Army, probably
That's
by a factor of
outrageous.
2 or 3. Oh no, I know. It's like the level of support for what we're doing in Alberta is huge. And then, of course, on top of it, we've been, working on a campaign, even, prior to, Carney being elected, to gather pledges for signatures on a referendum, to hold a referendum in Alberta, in and around, one simple question, right? And the question, I'll read it out, right now. The question, quite simply, is, hang on, let me find the actual, I'm looking for the actual question. The actual question is simply, do you agree that the province of Alberta shall become a sovereign country and cease to be a province of Canada? Yes or no? So I drafted this question along with, with my friend and colleague Keith Wilson. While we both had our copy of the Clarity Act open in front of us, and I think it's section 1, sub D, sub 4 of the Clarity Act that says a question, on independence from Canada must clearly state that the province wishes to become an independent country and cease to be a province of Canada. So the question itself comes directly from the wording of the Clarity Act and is Clarity
So
Act
tell me,
compliant. Yeah, go ahead.
So tell me, where is the Clarity Act from? Where did that come
Well,
from? When was that established?
I often refer to the Clarity Act as the Jean Chrétien Wishful Thinking Act, because what he did was leading up to the last Quebec referendum, or maybe it might have been shortly after. I've forgotten the timing now from an historical perspective, but decided that, after the Supreme Court came down with the secession reference, right, saying that in fact provinces could legally separate from Canada, blah blah blah, and set out the conditions under which a province could separate, Jean Chrétien decided that he was going to try to make it harder for provinces to separate by setting out what he saw as the terms and conditions, of separation for provinces from Canada. And keep in mind that the referendum questions in Quebec have typically been really, really wishy-washy and really hard to understand. It's like, and I don't have my binder in front of me. Otherwise,
It doesn't help they're in French either.
No. But even the English translation, right? It's like, do you agree that the province of Quebec, should become sovereign in accordance with, such and such a statement of principle of such and such a date and time and an agreement dated blah, 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 whatever, right? So it's like, basically the questions are predicated, on documents that aren't in evidence during the referendum, documents that people likely haven't even read or understood. So it was this idea that Quebec was holding these referendums, on these really vague terms that nobody understood. And Chrétien came along and said, no, you want to separate from Canada. We're going to put in a law in place, that makes it so that people clearly understand what they're voting for, right? And then requires, and then actually sets out a process, which is actually kind of helpful as to how it is that a province can leave Canada, which includes, negotiation with the federal government, consultation with First Nations, in a province, et cetera, et cetera. All of that's required, under the Clarity Act, right? The only issue is where it becomes really vague and problematic is there's paragraph 154 and 155 of the Quebec secession reference from the Supreme Court, where the Supreme Court said, well, we haven't really addressed this issue as to whether or not Quebec can separate from Canada under international law as a people. We'll kind of, we've considered the issue a little bit, but they're not an oppressed people. They can't demonstrate that they're being discriminated against within Canada, blah, blah, blah. But the interesting thing about it is if you look at paragraph 154, I think there's a pretty good argument to be made that Albertans are in fact an oppressed people. Right? We are discriminated against within Canada. All you have to do is look at the number of Supreme Court seats we have, for the whole West versus, Quebec and Ontario, and then look at the number of Senate seats we have compared to New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, and Newfoundland by population. Like it's shocking, and people in British Columbia should be pissed off about this too, right? So get this, right? So regardless of the fact that BC has what now, close to 10 million people, like if you look at Greater Vancouver and the rest of BC, right? You guys get 6 Senate seats. Guess how many seats that Nova Scotia gets with 1.1 million people? They get 10. No, they get 10.
Yeah.
And then New Brunswick with 900,000 people, right? They get 10. So literally between BC and Alberta, right? We have let's say 15 million people. That's just sort of off the top of my head, but roughly 15 million people. Between the two of us, we have 12 Senate seats with 15 million people, and New Brunswick and Nova Scotia with less than 2 million people or around 2 million people have 20. Right?
Yeah, it's outrageous.
Newfoundland, I haven't even bothered to look up the population of Newfoundland. It's minuscule compared to BC's or Alberta. Newfoundland has the same number of Senate seats as Alberta and Alberta and British Columbia.
And there's no talks of changing that or fixing that.
And that's why Alberta wants to separate. The only way to fix the Canadian Constitution is to break the country. So we break the country, we get Alberta the hell out, and then, as an independent nation state, we can then, negotiate, because we don't propose negotiating with Canada on bended knee as a province. Like, please, Canada, can we have our money back? We anticipate that the day that Alberta declares independent, or the day that Alberta has a valid referendum on independence, and the Alberta government declares itself independent from Canada, that we would instantly have recognition from the United States as an independent country, and other recognitions would follow in the same way as happened with Kosovo, right? Canada was one of the first countries to recognize the unilateral declaration of independence of Kosovo, right? So, our view is that Alberta,
there's a vested interest from my perspective. Like, there's a vested interest on the side of the United States. If Alberta becomes independent, then immediately trading increases. It gets better. All the barriers, all the blockades.
100%. Like if the day that Alberta becomes independent, I could see having a trade deal within a week with the United States that simply says this: 0 tariffs on the U.S. side of the border, 0 tariffs on the Alberta side of the border on all goods and services. It'll be with no exceptions, 1-page trade deal, right? So no, seriously,
we can all dream, right?
Yeah. No, I'm looking forward to doing that. It would be kind of a real feather in my cap at the end of my career to be able to negotiate a free trade agreement that was really a free trade agreement. It was absolutely free trade, less than a one-page deal that made it absolutely clear that that's what we were doing, and we moved forward on that basis. And then think about the fact, I don't want to focus on grievances and all this stuff about all the shitty things that that people from Toronto and Montreal have done to Alberta. We all know what what we're talking about.
We all know that, yeah.
Including declaring the Emergencies Act against us when we came to Ottawa to protest during the Freedom Convoy, and running over little Indigenous women with riot horses because David Lametti and Mark Mendocino couldn't get their hands on Leopard tanks to crush us under their treads like Tiananmen Square, like they wanted to.
In all fairness, that wasn't just Albertans, right? That was Canadians from all over.
No, fair enough, but we took it pretty personally, I have to say, right?
I would agree, yeah.
Right, like Albertans took it pretty personally. All the talk about our smelly diesel fuel and all that kind of stuff was kind of grating on our nerves. And then, and Tamara Lich. I mean, for God's sake, I mean, we know and love Tamara in this province. She's a lovely woman. I mean, they hauled her across this country in leg irons, because they alleged that she violated a bail condition by attending an event put on by JCCF. With her lawyers as required by her bail conditions. They put her, I want to swear almost right now, it makes me so angry. They put her in effing leg irons and drug her across the country in chains. Yeah. I mean, how disgusting is that? That this is the Canada that we all used to live in, right?
And their ordeal isn't over. They're still dealing with it.
No, and of course, no. I mean, prosecutors in Ontario want to put Tamara in an Ontario prison for 10 years. I mean, that's the kind of vindictive bullshit that we can expect from a Liberal government in Ottawa that is completely alien to the culture, thinking, and autonomy and love of freedom of Albertans, right? So those are the grievances. But let's look at the reasons that I think Albertans are going to separate. I was just talking to someone today who did a 60,000 person poll. I can't say who it is or the organization that did the polling yet because they haven't released it. But I'll tell you that they polled 60,000 Albertans in the last week, and the number of Albertans in favor of full independence from Canada has now risen to 44%. And that's without us having had the benefit of being able to have a full-blown educational campaign across the province, educating everybody in the province on the following benefits: no more federal income tax, no more federal corporate tax, no more GST, no more federal carbon tax, no more federal excise tax, no more federal fuel tax, and importantly for Alberta, no more bullshit federal regulations choking our industry and stifling our oil and gas production. No more Paris Climate Accord. No more carbon capture, carbon nonsense. Directed our way, choking off our industries. No more tanker bans, no more pipeline bans, no more, screwing around with oil tanker, rail tanker regulations so that there's not enough rolling stock to move Alberta oil from Alberta to Texas, et cetera, et cetera. Free of federal regulation and free of federal taxation, Alberta could double its oil production in less than 3 years. There would be no difficulty getting a pipeline deal with the United States to give us 5 new pipelines, including one to Tidewater in Washington State. And then finally, Alberta would be able to negotiate with the rest of Canada. It's like, oh, you don't want any more of our pipelines? Well, I guess we can put a 30% tariff then on all container goods moving through Alberta by rail. I mean, that's not a realistic, possibility, I don't think. But I mean, it's certainly going to make people sit up and start behaving like adults when it comes to dealing with Alberta, and put aside all this bullshit carbon, greenhouse gas foolishness that we've all been living under for the last 30 years, that whole fraud that we've been living with. I mean, everybody's seen the news today. I mean, NASA's just proven that the ice caps in Greenland, or not in Greenland, in Antarctica are growing.
Yep,
not melting. Nobody wants to talk about the fact that the vegetative mass of the planet Earth has increased by 20% over the last 40 years. None of that's been factored into any of these carbon calculations.
And that's thanks to the carbon dioxide,
absolutely.
actually. So.
We were on the point of carbon starvation as far back as 1850. We needed more CO2 in the atmosphere, or we weren't going to be able to feed ourselves. So all of this foolishness that we've been living under, as far as Alberta is concerned, is going to be completely over, right? And all the fetters and chains and blocks that have been put on the Alberta economy are going to be gone, right?
Well, let me ask you this.
Sure.
Let me ask you
I
this.
just want to finish this. I just want to finish
Okay.
this one point. Okay. And then think about this, right? So we're no longer going to be sending $70 billion a year to Ottawa to get very little back. So all of that money is going to stay in the Alberta economy. That will allow Alberta to have the lowest taxation rates in North America. We could have a 10% flat income tax rate. We could have a 10% flat corporate tax rate. All the other federal taxes would be gone, right? We'd be able to fully fund everything in Alberta, including a constitutionalized resource revenue sharing agreement with the First Nations of Alberta, right? That would make the handouts that they get from Ottawa look like a pittance, right? All of that could happen in very short order, and so the benefits of Alberta independence far outweigh any of their threats and any of the fear mongering that they're trying to direct at us. Sorry, so that was.
So I would like to get into the native question in a bit, but I want to ask. So, who's to say that the United States won't turn around and say, "Well, we want you to pay federal income tax if you're getting the benefit of our economy, you're getting the benefit of all these other things. Why don't you just be a state? Why don't we just usurp Alberta and force that in?"
Because we don't want to be a state. And the other thing is there's a process for states becoming states in the United States, right? Which includes includes a vote of the Senate and the Congress. And I think it's a 2/3 vote of the Senate to bring a territory or an independent state into full U.S. statehood, right? And I can tell you right now that there's no way that the Democrats would ever vote for a conservative Alberta joining the United States. It would be two more Republican Senate seats, and it would be 5. Because Alberta as a state, if we were a state, we'd be third largest after Alaska and Texas. We're only slightly smaller than Texas, interestingly. And I was surprised to learn we're almost twice as big as California. Right? Just looking at the numbers, right? Our population puts us somewhere between Alabama and Louisiana. So we'd be like the 25th largest state in the union out of 50 states, right? And we hold, the world's third largest oil reserves, and now probably the second or third largest natural gas reserves with the discovery of the 400 trillion cubic foot Montney gas field that straddles the Alberta-BC border, right?
But that's the point that I'm kind of getting to. Why would the U.S. look at that and go, well, then we'll put a tariff on you because you're benefiting so much from, and not only that, why would they allow you to get to Tidewater?
They don't want to tariff Canadian oil and gas, right? They don't want to tariff Canadian oil and gas because Trump's whole thing is that he wants to have way more oil and gas to bring the prices down so that the American economy can thrive with low priced energy, right? So once we take all of the Canadian taxes and regulations off of Alberta industry, we're highly profitable at $50 a barrel. We're highly profitable at $40 a barrel if we don't have to comply with any more federal, climate-driven energy, right? Or I'm sorry, regulations, right?
Right. So even if you're a discounted rate like it currently is, because you don't have access to Tidewater, it would still be profitable because you don't have all that.
But even then, there's a negotiation to be had, right? Like currently, Alberta is not successful in negotiating another pipeline with BC or Canada because we don't have the leverage. But again, if we have the ability to slap a 30% tariff on rail goods going through Alberta and Ontario, going through Alberta from BC to Ontario, our leverage changes. You don't want our oil, well then we don't want your fucking rail cars. Excuse my language, I shouldn't swear. But it's like, enough is enough, right? Like, we live in this stupid world where, Albertans are going, hey, we're contributing $70 billion a year to Canada. We get 30 billion back. So you're netting out $40 billion of Alberta tax money to the good of Canada. Quebec perennially gets 15 billion a year from Alberta taxpayers. But Quebec says, oh, yeah, we love Alberta money. We just don't want Alberta's dirty oil moving through our province by pipeline, right? So, if Alberta was an independent state, right, they'd be able to say, okay, Quebec, well, you don't want our oil. Well, we'll figure out what's going to hurt you the most if you're going to be that stupid. It will have way more leverage negotiating as an independent nation state than we do as a province on bended knee saying, please, rest of Canada, please treat us fairly. We know you love our money, but we'd really like it if you liked us. Enough of this pathetic bullshit. It's just time.
Well, who's in charge of internal trade right now? That was just appointed. Well,
not Gibault. Is it the gibbering
Christopher
Gibault?
Eland.
Oh,
It's
Christopher
Christopher
Freeland. Oh,
Freeland.
yeah, there we go. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Transportation and internal trade.
Yeah,
That's
there we
great.
go. Yeah, of course. Right.
So that's obviously not a good or ideal situation for Alberta as it stands. So this is what's happened. Everyone was hoping for a conservative majority government. That's where the polls were sitting months ago. Then Trudeau resigns. Everything flips. It goes over. Canada elects Mark Carney because apparently boomers were afraid of Donald Trump. This was I'm not kidding. This is
I'm
the
glad
polls
you
are
brought
saying.
that up. Oh, no, and that whole election was run on Carney and the Liberals fooling people in Ontario and Quebec who have massive Trump derangement syndrome and thinking that Donald Trump is an existential threat and that we have to elect Mark Carney because he's the only guy tough enough to stand up to Trump. And then what does Carney do today? He goes down to the White House and it's almost like he sat in Donald Trump's lap. Hi, Uncle Donald. I'm just happy to be here. And then he rolls over on the carpet and shows his belly like a submissive puppy. Doesn't say a word back to Trump while President Trump is schooling him like a 6-year-old. It was perfect. And then Carney's comment was, oh, yes, and President Trump, you're a transformational president. Oh, I love you so much. I couldn't believe that Carney said
It's
that
gross.
today. Oh,
It's
I know.
gross.
It's just disgusting. He had his head so far
I
up
tweeted
Trump's
this out.
Oh,
So I
I
tweeted
know.
this out. Canadian boomers waiting for those elbows to go up, but only seeing thumbs up.
Oh, I know. I mean, it's just hilarious, right? I mean, it's like, hey, it's Ontario, it's like Toronto and Montreal. Psych, right?
People got hoodwinked. This whole election was a hoodwink.
It was a fraud from start to finish. And of course, Trump's happy that Carney was elected because Trump's going to be happy to see Alberta, separate from Canada and see the rest of Canada fall apart and negotiate individual deals with the United States on a province by province basis on trade and everything else, right?
And it looks like that's the direction that it's going because popularity of this concept, even like trending all over the place, Alberta independence seems to be the thing. I know a lot of people are talking about 51st state. Now, here's the thing I want to bring up. So this is the idea that because the Trump derangement syndrome worked so well for the election and all these people became very afraid of Donald Trump, Orange Man bad, all of that stuff. So much so that they voted against their own pocketbooks. They voted against their own children's future. And they went with Mark Carney because he had elbows up. And what I'm thinking is the campaign against the Alberta Prosperity Project, this citizen-led initiative, I think is going to be that you guys want to become the 51st state, and they're going to drill that one in. So how do you reassure people that this is really an independence project?
Well, no, but I guess first of all, I'm not telling tales out of school. This has already been publicized, but I mean, we went down, we have a delegation to Washington project that we're doing that I was involved in starting, having a group of prominent Albertans in favor of independence going down to the US to meet with the Trump administration to talk about the benefits to both the United States and Alberta of Alberta independence, right? So when we were down there and we were meeting with the administration at a very, very high level, they've asked us at this point not to say who we were meeting with and whatever, but I can assure you we were, we were, one or two people off of the Oval Office. What the discussions were all about Alberta independence, not 51st statehood, because they understand what the polling in the United States, they understand what the polling is in Alberta, and they understand that the majority of the people involved in the Alberta independence movement, don't want to jump out of Canada and free ourselves from the clutches of CRA only to jump into US statehood and then subject ourselves to the regulations of, the EPA, IRS, and all the federal agencies in the United States. So, what we say is, look, it's like getting out of a marriage. Like, don't just jump in, in this case, just don't get out of one country just to jump into your rebound country. It's important. It's important that you have some time for yourself. Sorry, did I almost make your old fashioned out of your nose? I apologize.
Yeah, you did.
So anyway, we're very clear on that. And I mean, there's lots of people in the Alberta 51st state movement, that are very upset about the fact that, our referendum question, doesn't involve, Alberta becoming a state. But what I would point out to them is, like, everybody just needs to understand that, first of all, we have to comply with the Clarity Act, right, to make sure that the question is clear and unambiguous. And if you had, do you want Alberta to become a sovereign country and cease to be a Canadian province? And then if you add the words "and to join the United States," it adds a layer of hypotheticality, ambiguity, and conditionality to the question, such that it could be struck down by the courts as being void or voidable, and not a clear question on a referendum. So what we're telling everybody,
you can also divide the people who are in support of it. Like,
and it's like, what we're telling everybody is, look, it's one step at a time. The first step on the road to anywhere is independence from Canada, right? Let's get out of Canada, right? And and become the wealthiest nation in the world, with the highest GDP per capita in the world, with the lowest tax regime of any jurisdiction in North America, right? I think, if we had a 10% flat income tax and a 10% flat corporate tax, I think the only jurisdiction in even North and South America in the Western Hemisphere is like Ecuador, that has like an 8% tax rate, right? So,
and you would actually have more revenue because less people would avoid it. More people would just pay it.
But of course, and on top of it, the biggest problem that we would have in Alberta is there'd be a massive building boom at Edmonton and Calgary, because corporate head offices from all over North America would be flooding in to take advantage of 10% corporate tax, low personal income taxes, all of the freedom that that a new Alberta Constitution could offer, et cetera, right? So, who wouldn't want to be here under those circumstances, right? So
exactly,
so that's what we're looking forward to. And again, that's getting back to talking to my fellow Albertans about the benefits of independence, rather than focusing on the grievances of being stuck in a country led by somebody as idiotic as Mark Carney. We'll come back to that in a minute. But but anyway, that's the big question. Like, we're polling at 44% right now, but that's without Albertans being asked this question. Instead of, do you favor Alberta independence, right? Do you favor an immediate 30% to 50% pay raise, right? Which is effectively what ending all federal taxes and regulations would mean for every individual Albertan. They would be the wealthiest that they've ever been. They would have way more disposable income to take care of their families, to live better lives, et cetera, right? It would be wonderful. And that's the big issue that people need to get their heads around, right? Like, do you want, and what can Carney and, any of the Team Canada people offer? Oh, well, they can hang out the possibility of dangling we're gonna be an energy superpower, and maybe we'll give Alberta a couple billion of its own dollars back to make some hydrogen plants, to not that bad oil that you have, because that's not sustainable. We'll have, you can have a few billion of your own dollars back in subsidies for hydrogen plants, and we'll come up with a whole bunch of other bullshit schemes that require us giving you a little bit more of your money back, but not too much, on the road to creating some bullshit energy superpower.
But it's the same people that for 10 years that have been in power. Why would they change their mind now?
Do you think the gibbering Gibault, as Mark Carney's Quebec lieutenant, is going to tolerate any changes to the environmental Nazism that they've imposed on Alberta over the last 10 years?
You know what ministry he has now? Incidentally, he's in charge. He's the Ministry of Culture.
Oh, of course. Yeah, well, that's probably a good place for him. Hey, but I want your listeners, I'm just going to play a clip of how stupid Mark Carney is, that I want people to truly internalize. This was Mark Carney 3 days before the election in Edmonton. Listen to this.
Relationship with the United States is over. And America's leadership of the global economy is over.
Right?
That's laughable.
How could anybody say anything that stupid? It's like, Canada's relationship with the United States is over, right? And
that's crazy enough. I didn't hear the second part of that before.
Canada's relationship with the U.S. is over, and then he goes down to the White House and sits in Uncle Donald's lap.
But it's like this idea that the United States is no longer gonna control all the ports around the world and all these things that the United States has military everywhere, the largest economy in the planet. Is that going to disappear because of Mark Carney?
Mark Carney's so delusional that he thinks that he can offset the complete loss of Canadian jobs and the Canadian economy by destroying our trading relationship with the United States by, get this, having Canada join the European Union, right?
And do,
so
and
here,
do
let
what
me
with
just
that?
one little phrase that I want you to internalize. I would like a bureaucrat in Brussels to tell me how many cows I can have on my ranch and what I'm supposed to feed them and when I'm supposed to put my crops in and how much fertilizer I'm allowed to use. Said no Albertan ever. Right? Like,
Well, did you
know,
hear about that
I mean,
Alberta farmer who he sold a couple dozen too many eggs and they threw him in jail?
Oh, I know. I mean, and of course the RCMP aren't running around locking up, people that are illegally selling homegrown marijuana, because, in support of all the federal marijuana licenses that they issued to people that cost them millions and millions and millions of dollars to develop. So it's like, hey, we'll go to war and we'll lock up Alberta farmers, over a couple dozen eggs because that supports the Quebec Dairy Board marketing system. But heaven forbid that we actually crack down on the illegal sale and supply of drugs in Canada. When there's a federal licensing system that that we suckered people into investing millions and millions of dollars with complying with. And all the Canadian shareholders that were invested in cannabis companies that lost their shirts and all the rest of it, the Canadian government did nothing for them, is doing nothing for them, but we're going to lock up an egg farmer, right?
So this gets me into a really important question, and this is then who polices Alberta when Alberta becomes independent?
That's the whole point. Alberta's going to police Alberta. And I think it's really important that we do, throw out every single federal regulation and rule in Alberta. We obviously there'd be transitional period, transitional periods while we rewrite, federal laws to make sense in Alberta, like the criminal code as an example, right? There'd have to be a transitional provision to maintain the criminal law in Alberta, et cetera, things like that, right? But, so much of what Albertans are being subjected to. I mean, the whole dairy marketing board scheme, if you think about it, literally forces Albertans and people across this country to pay 400% more than they should for milk and eggs and cheese and everything else. So every single mom in BC that's on welfare, or social assistance, we don't call it welfare anymore, that's on social assistance, every Indigenous family, on reserves across British Columbia and Alberta, wherever, Saskatchewan, they're all paying 400% more than they should for milk because politicians have been bought off by the dairy cartel to support that whole scheme. And in fact, our entire national economy, if you think about it, is being put at risk because heaven forbid that the sacred Canadian dairy, monopoly is somehow the subject of a trade negotiation that would see a free flow of milk and milk products between Alberta and the United States on a zero tariff basis. Right?
This one's always been a confusion for me because people say, oh, well, they subsidize milk in America. Well, what if if American taxpayers want to pay us to drink milk, is that a problem? Take the milk.
Well, no, and then on top of it, if you think about it, literally the way that milk pricing is done in Canada, were it not for the statute that sets up the marketing board, allowing that to happen, it would be patently illegal as an illegal price fixing scheme, under the Competition Act and otherwise. think about that lawsuit that went, on bread against all the big grocery stores that were allegedly, fixing the price of bread for, 10 cents or 20 cents a loaf or whatever it was. Well, this isn't 10 or 20 cents a loaf. This is 400, 500%. If you have a dairy license and 100 cows, you're raking in millions of dollars a year. And then if you're if you're a beef farmer and you have a couple head of beef cattle, you're lucky if you time the markets correctly to make a couple $100,000 versus the millions that they could make, if you could actually have some milk cows on your property under the present scheme, right? Mm-hmm. So, what I actually challenged Pierre Poilievre, who's now running in Alberta. It's like, hey, Pierre, if you want to prove you're an Albertan, two things. One, I want to hear you denounce any more Alberta tax money going to Quebec for any reason whatsoever, right? Because if you support a $15 billion a year money grab out of Alberta for Quebec, you're not an Albertan. So
we're not in Carleton anymore.
We're not in Carleton anymore, Pierre. You're going to one of the most rural ridings in the province God bless Battle River Crowfoot. And I hope people in the riding tell him that. And then the second thing is, Pierre, like here's a slogan I have for you. Okay. No more Alberta tax dollars for Quebec, and a milk cow and a micro dairy in every barn. I dare you. Right? I double dog dare you to say that you are in favor of cutting off all transfers to Quebec, and that you're in favor of every farmer in Alberta that wants to have a milk cow, that his wife or kids can have a milk cow, and they can take milk out of that milk cow and run it through their own small home pasteurization plant and sell the milk at the farmer's market every weekend if they want to, right? I dare you, Pierre. Right?
So I want to get back to the policing question, though. So the idea is so RCMP runs most of the policing throughout the province. What's the transition look like, and how long does it take to transition from RCMP to a local police force?
Well, I mean, I think they're already underway in Alberta, in that regard. I mean, there's issues with the RCMP contract. There's talks about putting a provincial police force in place, whatever. Timing on that, it would obviously have to be sooner rather than later, right? But there's going to be negotiations following an independence vote. And certainly if Alberta immediately votes yes, or votes this year for independence, that's going to force the provincial government to step up the hiring of provincial police and getting ready to completely terminate the RCMP contract in Alberta. Like, it's not going to be an end of law and order in Alberta. Right?
Oh no, I didn't think that. Yeah. I was just like, how long does a transition like that take?
I don't know. I mean, I'm a 10, like everybody, you know me. I'm a 10,000 foot guy. There's other people that are working on these details.
Okay, right? That's fair. Yeah. That's fair,
right?
But one of the big contests, like when people contest against this, they say, "Oh, it's never going to happen. If it does, it'll take 10 years to occur."
I think the funniest thing was that all the never going to happen people are now eating their hats because they know it's going to happen now. Right. And,
that's the thing.
And on top of it, all the polling that we're looking at indicates that not only is it going to happen, but we're going to succeed. Like, you got to keep in mind. So I told you that we have these 15,000 new volunteers on top of, the 75,000 APP members and supporters that we had previously logged prior to Carney being elected, right? So that takes us up to probably 90,000 activists within the Alberta Prosperity Project, right? So we're literally planning an 87 constituency door knocking campaign in support of the petition. And I need to come back to that because I need to tell you how many signatures we now have that are verified on the petition.
Oh yeah, I'd like to know. Yeah.
87 constituency door knocking campaign on support of the petition. And then we're going to have an 87 constituency door knocking campaign in support of the actual referendum. Like, we're organized. We have the bodies, we have the people. And as of today, I am proud to announce that APP internally has been verified as of today. We've been having issues with the website that our ticker isn't keeping up with the numbers. We were over 148,000 at one point today, and then we got stuck again. But anyway, these are all glitches that we're working on. But as of today, we are officially internally at 220,000 verified names, addresses, and emails for 220,000 people who have pledged their support to sign a petition in favor of independence. Right. So
that's enough. That's enough with the
new. The number on Danielle's new legislation is 177,000. We're almost. I would wager by now we're 50,000 over what's required under the new legislation, and we anticipate that by next week we're going to be over 300,000, and by the end of the month, by the end of May, right, we're going to be over 600,000, which is the number that was required under the old legislation.
So you're going to just go forward with the old legislation so you don't have to wait until this new legislation passes?
Theoretically we could, but the new legislation is coming, and we're moving forward one way or another. I mean, obviously logistically it makes our lives a bit easier if we can get 200,000 verified signatures in a month, and we can have that would allow us to have a referendum on on independence in October. That's kind of what we're hoping for and what we're organizing for. But we are
this October.
Oh yeah, absolutely. We could have it with because there's obviously a concern. I was having a chat with some people in government today, because I was pretty ticked about Premier Smith's speech yesterday, and I was explaining that maybe I shouldn't be so mad and whatever. But when she came out and said, "Oh yeah, we're gonna have our next deal, our what's next panels this summer, and then we're gonna come up with a bunch of referendum questions that come out of the what's next panels, and then we'll have the independence referendum simultaneous to a bunch of other referenda on issues that come out of the what's next panels," right?
Oh, that just creates confusion, does it not?
Of course it does. And it seemed to me to be that it was deliberately intentional, and it was a smoke and mirrors show that was being proposed. But I've got assurances at the highest level, from the highest levels of the Alberta government, that that's not what's going on, and that
if there's a referendum, it should be one question.
Oh no,
only.
it's got to be a clear question, and we have the question, and I've read it out to you, right?
Yes.
In fact, if you want, just so that you've got it, I'll text it to you so you can put it up on the screen and share it with your viewers. Because I think it's important that people understand, what we're doing, why we're doing it, how we're doing it, et cetera. And we want to be obviously, as transparent about this, as we possibly can be, right? So just let me find it again. I've sent it to so many people now, so many times that, right?
I think you did message it to me, but it was a bit ago, and I'm just scrolling through my thing here. There's a very specific verbiage used in it.
Well, yeah, and the reason that there's very specific language that's used in it is because that language, completely complies with with the Clarity Act. There, I found it. So I'm gonna copy it from my phone and send it to you.
I've got it already.
Oh, okay, cool.
So the verbiage is: do you agree that the province of Alberta shall become a sovereign country and cease to be a province of Canada? Yes or no? Very, very straightforward.
Yeah, I wanted to put, and we were having a debate about it. Cease to be a subjugated province of Canada or an inferior province of Canada. But we kicked it around, and we felt that, that was too argumentative and, could impart a level of vagueness to the question that would allow somebody to avoid the question. But that's as clear as it gets, and it complies perfectly, with Section 1 sub D sub 4 of the Clarity Act, right? So that's right out of the Clarity Act. That's the question that we need to take a province out of Canada. And I have to thank Jean Chrétien for providing us such a clear roadmap. Right? So anyway, pitter patter, we're getting after it, right? So, and
it looks like
we're obviously very excited about it, right? So we've now gone from Jason Kenney going, "Oh, these are just a bunch of lunatic fringe extremists that are the tail wagging the dog and blah blah blah," to people now realizing that this is a real deal. This is a real thing. And that it's like when you have hundreds of thousands of people supporting something, and when you literally have families sitting around their dinner tables, and people in the pubs and people in the bars are sitting around talking about how much better off their lives are going to be in an independent Alberta, it's a movement. And it's a movement that's not going to be put back in a box by some politician, that wants to be on Team Canada and, oh my goodness, blah, 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 right? It's
afraid of Trump, of Trump.
Yeah, whatever.
I can see the fear campaigns already. It's going to be afraid of Trump. You're going to lose your pension, all these other things, right?
Oh, yeah, and of course, $70 billion a year is going to stay in Alberta. So you don't think that means that Alberta is going to have better hospitals, better schools, better pensions, with a thriving economy, and not sending $70 billion a year to a foreign government and, in Ottawa? Of course not. We're done being colonized. We're done being the colonial serfs of Canada, and we're done being, the oppressed colonial serfs of Quebec and Ontario, and, are going to keep, all of our wealth in Alberta for Albertans, including Alberta's Indigenous people. Which I think is a very, very important part of what we're doing.
So this is an important part, because a lot of people have brought this up to me, especially because this conversation has been taking place, and now you see it out in the media. So this was a clip that was going viral yesterday of a chief. I'll just let it speak for itself and pop the clip up here. So this is a chief in rural Canada saying, "No way, Jose, you can't leave."
This isn't a newish issue. Quebec tried to do this way back when. At the same time, you Can't do it. There's treaty. All of Canada is treaty territory. It's inherent rights. First Nations were here first. We welcomed people from, to our shores. We welcome people with open arms. We want to build a beautiful country together. But at the same time, if people aren't happy in this beautiful country that we're building together, then you're free to go and live wherever you want. But you can take the dirt that maybe your ancestors brought with them when they came over here from other places. That's the only piece of land that you're going to take. But you're not going to take any treaty land, any inherent land from any of our First Nations people across our beautiful country that we all share. So you're welcome here, but at the same time, if you're not happy here, you're free to go.
You're free to go. Obviously not take Alberta with it. So this was a Liberal, actually someone who works with the Liberal Party. Her name is Cindy Woodhouse Nipenick. Yeah, and she's affiliated with the Liberal Party of Canada.
No, but again, and obviously I've spent my entire career fighting for the rights of First Nations people, and I have to tell you that nobody disrespects the rights of First Nations more than the government of Canada. And I mean, that's been clear. Anytime that a First Nation raises, a right with Canada that, whether it's under their treaty or otherwise, Canada's response is, to tell them to go pound sand, force them to litigate for 20 or 30 years, and then pay them pennies on the dollar at the end of the day as a settlement after they've drug whatever the issue is out as long as possible. I mean, that's been Canada's modus of operandi as long as I've been practicing law and suing Canada on behalf of First Nations people in Alberta, British Columbia, the Northwest Territories, and elsewhere, for my entire career. So I would not be doing this if I did not believe in my heart of hearts that there was a far better deal to be reached, a constitutionalized deal with the province of Alberta that fully respects, the Alberta treaties, the inherent Aboriginal rights of Alberta First Nations, and, would put in place, a resource revenue sharing deal that would dwarf the federal dollars that First Nations have to go to Ottawa to beg for on bended knee on an ongoing basis. Like, it's clear, under Treaty 6 as an example, that post-secondary education is a treaty right. But anytime a Treaty 6 Indian goes into, or a First Nations person under Treaty 6 goes into, whatever the hell they call Indian Affairs now, whether it's CERNA or, whatever it is, and says, hey, I'm here, I want to enroll in post-secondary education this fall. Where's the money for that? Quite often they get back, oh, gee, we're really sorry. We're full up this year. The envelope has been spent. We don't have enough money. Unfortunately, you'll have to try again later, right? So, they treat the treaty right to education as if it were a policy decision as opposed to a right. When have you ever heard somebody, hey, I have a right. Well, come back and talk to us in a couple of years and we'll decide whether or not we're going to, whether we're going to, whether we're going to honor that right. And, and for anybody that wants to quibble with me over whether post-secondary education is a treaty right, the government of Canada, believe it or not, actually litigated the issue in the context of a payday loans outfit that tried to garnish a woman in Saskatchewan's education payments from Indian Affairs. And Indian Affairs actually went to court with the Department of Justice and said, oh, no. These funds aren't subject to seizure because these are funds that are being paid pursuant to a treaty right to post-secondary education. So that's what they say, on one hand when they're in court, but then on the other hand, if First Nations people are going into the government of Canada to say, hey, here's my educational plan. This is what I want to do this year. I want to enroll a welding school. I want to do this. I want to do that, whatever it is. Canada goes, oh, gee, we're sorry. We're all out of money this year, maybe next year, right? That's been going on for decades. First Nations people have been getting screwed by the government of Canada left, right, and center. And if anybody thinks that, that they're not going to get a better deal out of the Commonwealth of Alberta when it's an independent country, when we have $70 billion that we're no longer sending to Canada, I think that, people need to open their minds and understand that this is an opportunity, rather than a loss. And certainly for First Nations, that want to remain as federal enclaves within Alberta and be, continue to be governed by, the Indian Act and INAC employees and, whatever, Indian Affairs type people, that option's open. Nobody's taking that away from them. But this suggestion, that the Chiefs have that somehow or other, Danielle Smith can't pass legislation, empowering, citizens of Alberta to vote on how it is that they want to be governed. I don't think, passes any test, legally that I'm aware of. And I've probably argued more consultation cases than any lawyer in Canada, it's nobody from the province of Alberta is telling, First Nations how they should govern themselves when they govern themselves under custom. They don't tell First Nations, well, we don't like the fact that you're choosing to be governed under the Indian Act rather than customary law. You should be under customary law, not the Indian Act. It's none of our goddamn business. We don't tell First Nations people how to organize themselves and how they're going to be governed. So, I don't know that, in this circumstance, First Nations have fully internalized what it is that they're saying in telling Albertans that they have no right to decide how they want to be governed in the future. And certainly they have a vote as well. First Nations are not going to be excluded from any referendum vote. If people think it's a bad deal, they can vote no. A lot of their fellow Albertans may in fact vote no. We don't know yet. But the polling sure indicates that it's moving in our direction because everybody in Alberta is going to be voting themselves a massive pay raise to get the hell out of Canada.
It sure does.
Go ahead.
I was going to say it sure does, and I wanted to get back to the conversation about when. So everybody poo-pooing this idea is saying it's going to take forever. Don't even bother. This is nuts. Why are you doing it? It's going to take forever, as if. And I keep hearing this 10-year number as if there's like a litmus test for countries becoming independent from or provinces becoming independent from other countries. When I look at the situation, I look at Brexit, for example. So Brexit was Great Britain separating from the European Union. And when that happened, it was an upset. They were completely dumbfounded by the fact that this took place, that the people chose that when they were given that option. And it seemed like the entire apparatus around it was not incentivized to make it happen. Yet it still happened within 3 years, I believe it was. And lawyers, business people, governments, they were all dragging their feet because they benefited from keeping it in place for a certain amount of time. I'm looking at the opposite kind of situation in Alberta. If the vote goes yes, leave the country, I see all of the apparatus having an incentive, everybody having the incentive to get it done quickly. We're all going to save money.
Well, no, but on top of it, the minute Alberta votes yes to becoming an independent country and no longer a province of Canada, the government of Alberta will immediately advise the government of Canada that there'll be no longer any federal tax collection whatsoever in the province of Alberta. Their money's going to be cut off on day one. Because Alberta's not going to negotiate from a position of weakness with Canada. We're done with that. This whole idea that we're going to negotiate a better place within Canada, a stronger Alberta, a strong Alberta within a strong Canada. The West has been saying the West wants in for 40 years and it's gotten us nowhere, right? So, and I'd like to remind people that the very definition of insanity is doing the same stupid thing over and over and over again and expecting a different result. So why would anybody think that this time when we go to Ottawa and bend the knee and say, please, can we have some of our money back? And can we have some more pipelines? And can we please be treated with respect? Why do you think this time is going to be any different? Right? It's not. It's, we're already seeing it. It's, this whole idea that Danielle, wants to put together a negotiating team right now to negotiate with Canada, she should be sitting back and cheering on the referendum, and she should be supporting it. It's yeah, we want a negotiating position. So, she should basically be telling all of her caucus and cabinet ministers and everybody else, this is a matter of conscience. Everybody's allowed a free vote. Right? And anybody that wants to take a couple of weeks off to go door knocking in support of Alberta independence, if you think that's the right thing to do, fill your boots. Go, feel free. Go be Albertan for a couple of weeks. See how good it feels. Nothing wrong with that.
So I got one last quick question before we get
Sure.
into the Q&A session. So everybody who's watching this, stick around. If you're watching this after the fact, you got to watch it live to get the Q&A. So last question before the Q&A. Alberta leaves. Alberta becomes independent. What does Canada do with the national debt? Does Alberta take a portion of it with them after
No,
paying
Alberta
all
tells
those transfer
Alberta
taxes?
tells Canada to stuff it up its ass. I mean, quite frankly, I know I'm serious, right? It's like we put what like if you look at all of the money that Alberta's put into Canada in transfers, over the last the last 50 years, right? It's somewhere close to $1 trillion. And then if you calculate interest on that, it's in the multiple of trillions of dollars. I mean, the only thing we want from Canada is our $339 billion share of the Canada Pension Plan back. And, Canada can go on its merry way, and we'll keep all the military bases and the national parks and whatever else as compensation for the extra trillion that Canada is not going to be able to afford to pay us back for all the money that we put into Quebec. So, that's the negotiation, and that's the discussion we're going to have with Canada, but that's certainly the position that I think Alberta should take on a going forward basis. And again, negotiating from a position of strength as a, independent nation state, going forward. And for people worried about their pensions, again, think about the fact that $70 billion a year is no longer going to be going to Canada. It's going to be staying in Alberta, right? Canada takes $9 billion a year out of Alberta in CPP, right? They only put $3 billion back. So what that means effectively is that the total pension load in Alberta right now is only $3 billion. Alberta can afford to self-fund that until we sort out whatever the deal is with the United States. Or I'm sorry, not with the United States, with Canada, right? So, people don't need to worry about their pensions. I am confident that their pensions are going to be not only protected, but are going to be better in the long run in an independent Alberta than remaining in Canada. Canada's legal obligation to pay CPP doesn't change. If a Canadian citizen lives in Alberta, they're going to be as entitled to a Canadian pension plan pension as if they were a retired Canadian living in Florida or Ecuador or Costa Rica or wherever. It's an entitlement.
Great point.
The other thing that I want my fellow Albertans to internalize, you don't lose your Canadian citizenship if we vote ourselves out of Canada. Canada doesn't recognize the renunciation of citizenships. I mean, Jesus Christ, how many citizenships does Mark Carney have? He claimed he was going to renounce his EU citizenship, his Irish citizenship, his UK citizenship. For all we know, he's got a US green card and a US citizenship too that he hasn't told us about from working with Brookfield. We don't know. But I mean, Carney's got citizenships all over the place because he's a globalist. That's what they do. I'm sure he's got a UN passport hidden somewhere too, right? Where does he really belong anyway? But if you're an Albertan, right, you're still going to be Canadian. You're still going to have a Canadian passport. It doesn't affect your Canadian citizenship, but you're going to have the benefit of living in the wealthiest, most tax-free, and most free jurisdiction in the Western Hemisphere. With the ability to thrive and not have to worry any longer about arbitrary federal regulations, seizing your personal property, taking your guns away, shutting down your businesses, telling you can't get on airplanes, and all the other crap that we've had to put up with from Ottawa, in the last 5 years, right? So, I see nothing but immediate positives from a yes vote for independence. Whereas the only thing Canada has to, and so-called Team Canada has to sell us, is vague promises of mega projects that may never appear and threats of recriminations and, nostalgia. Like somebody asked me, won't you feel nostalgic for Canada? I said, what, nostalgic for the country that told me I wasn't allowed to fly on an airplane anymore?
When you call that Stockholm syndrome, that's...
Yeah, well, I have the opposite of Stockholm syndrome. I'm just pissed off. I'm still pissed off.
Fair.